My name is Michele Museyri from HSP Group. We help companies day in and day out when they are going into a new country or trying to figure out how to go into a new country, where they should go, what their requirements might be. So it's a really great partnership. I'm thrilled to just kind of take you through this world of international expansion. So there's a lot of considerations for why companies may go overseas. Obviously, these are all things that will be familiar to you. You have new customers that you want to get closer to. It's another source of an income stream for your company. You need to unlock access to additional talent that you don't have access to perhaps anymore in the US, and also to boost your brand recognition overseas. You also may have your competitors who are starting to go overseas, and it's starting to make your leadership a bit nervous about whether you should be doing the same. Or you could also have kind of a once-in-a-lifetime pandemic, hypothetically speaking, that shuts down supply chains all around the world, and now you have to start thinking a lot more creatively about what your next steps will look like. So regardless of what takes you internationally, the questions about how to prepare start coming up a bit fast and furious, right? So it's, we're thinking about European presence or a LATAM presence. What country should we be thinking about? And does it vary by industry that we may be in? Or is it going to affect, whether we hire employees from an EUR perspective or we hire them locally to local entities? And what does that supply chain look like? How are we going to be moving our supplies? Do we want to have a European presence so we can have one VAT registration, or do you have to register across all 50-something European countries in order to make this possible? So all these questions start to come up quite quickly, and it requires a lot of research, a lot of advisory in order to figure out from an industry perspective, from a labor perspective, and also from a financial perspective. So all of this starts to come into play, and at some point, we have to start thinking about what are the steps, what's the checklist, how do we put together a plan? And so from a risk perspective, a lot of times it's going to be the finance team, the HR team, the legal team are all starting to come together to identify what are actually the international compliance requirements and who's going to watch over all this, who's going to make sure them haven't missed a step anywhere. What are the cultural differences? What does it mean to hire someone in one country versus another, even neighboring countries that have significantly different cultural values and cultural responsibilities? And of course, the cost of the initial investment to make sure this isn't going to be something that they're going to basically jump into and then decide that it really wasn't a good idea. So a lot of times we have clients urged to saying, I really want to just dip my toe. I want to stick, let's say a business development person in this particular country, or we just want to hire a few engineers, see how it goes, and start to do it a little bit slower. Every single country has a long list of nuances that are going to be specific to that country. But this can obviously be very daunting from someone who may be trying to establish presence across different jurisdictions, even, again, neighboring countries. Spain, for example, if you're going to be traveling internationally, filling out different documentation to make sure that you have the approvals that you need. In France, medical checks, collective bargaining agreements, checking these lists of supplemental benefits that almost act as mandatory benefits. Things in Germany by filling out nil tax filings. So once you have an entity incorporate, being immediately ready to start filing with the tax agency locally. Brazil having more than 5,000 different municipalities and trying to figure out what does that mean from a tax perspective? What does that mean from a legal compliance perspective? And how do I make sure that I'm not missing any of the laws? Because it's really important to be operating compliantly in a country. There are some countries in Asia that actually have quite draconian retribution if you don't follow all of the laws, even if it happens to be a misstep. So, and of course, everyone's favorite in Japan by measuring the waistlines of employees between the ages of 40 and 70 to just make sure everybody is in good shape, which would go really well in the United States. So when we look at this, these preparations for international growth, we're looking at, first we have to identify what is that target market that we want to grow into, and what are the activities that we want to do. Are we, kind of what we said before, are we really just checking it out from a business development perspective? Are we building a factory? Are we going to start doing research and development? So, and each of the different countries that we're looking at are going to have a different idea of what it means to operate compliantly based on the work that you're doing and the number of people you have locally, and whether that's going to require you to actually pay taxes to the government or if there's ways for you to get around it while maybe you're still assessing. You have to familiarize yourself with the specific obligations, all of the registrations from a tax perspective, a payroll perspective, an HR perspective, to make sure that you're not missing a business license requirement, so that you get set up, everything's ready, and then suddenly the CFO gets a phone call that we need a few months, we didn't know we needed a local bank account with capital injection ready to go, and suddenly you have to take a few steps back. So determining all this up front, I think that the most important key when it comes to international expansion is the pre-preparation and asking a lot of the questions and making sure that we have a strategy when it comes to paying the employees that we want to hire or that we're transferring over, and getting, of course, the benefits set up. And in order to do that, you have to map out also how much time it takes, because every country is different. You look at China and Japan, setting up an entity in those countries can take anywhere from 6 to 9 months. In the UK, you can get it done in just a few days. And this is obviously really easy and not stressful at all. So when we think about an entity overseas, there's a lot that goes into it, and it's these teams, the leadership that really all need to work together to make it happen. You have the entity incorporation, you have tax registrations, a local bank account that's probably required in the country, but sometimes you can get away with a neighboring country bank account or from another country overseas. You have to do your bookkeeping country, you have to file your taxes, you have to pay the employees, and of course you have to make sure that someone is managing from an HR perspective. And this is really interesting because when you think about, even when you're expanding overseas, and you may have 2 people here, a person there, and you start to really grow your international operations, there's going to be a period of time where you're still having growing pains. You haven't quite gotten big enough to have anybody in-house or country-specific for, let's say, HR administration, but you're too big to be, to call other companies and have somebody else do each of the countries. So you may decide, I actually want to have somebody regionally who's going to oversee all of that. So all of these decisions about how to set that up, when are the right thresholds, start moving into different models, what does that look like? What does that cost? How do we create that cost structure for the CFO who's probably going to be requiring it tomorrow? So with this local compliance and operating and hiring internationally, there's a few ways that we can go about doing it. I'm sure everyone's quite familiar with, the PEO model that we have in the United States, very common in terms of this co-employment. And then we have the employer of record model that's very common overseas, where you're really just outsourcing all of that back office that we just talked about to somebody else to deal with it. So the employees, you have the opportunity to say, okay, the employees are going to get hired. We're going to hire this engineer that I found, he's amazing, in Romania, and I'm going to hire him to that company's local entity. And that company is going to deal with processing the payroll and doing benefits and the different things. But there are so many situations where that's not going to be a viable solution. And so you have to really make sure that you're checking whether, are we doing an employer of record, or are we going to set up a legal entity overseas? Usually this is really based on permanent establishment. So are you creating a taxable presence? And if you are creating a taxable presence, which is a moving target in every single country, because we should obviously make this as complicated as possible, but once you do create a taxable presence and you reach that threshold, then you're going to be responsible for paying your taxes. And so how do you do that? Of course, that's set up a legal entity. The government wants to be monitoring how much revenue are you generating, and then of course they want a piece of it. So there are many situations where companies will start with an employer of record, but then grow out of it. And so the question is, what are our 5-year, 10-year, or even 18-month plans look like? And so does it make sense to start with one model and then transfer to another? And what are the implications of moving off of an employer of record? Because if that third party is hiring my employee, that means that that third party has to fire my employee. And are there severance challenges associated with that? Are there litigation concerns associated with that? So there's a lot at stake in jumping in without kind of doing a lot of this pre-planning and thinking about what that future model is going to look like. So when we think about setting up an entity overseas, it's not quite as simple as calling the attorney and saying, get me an entity in Luxembourg and let me know in a few days when it's ready. Oftentimes, if you work with an attorney, they're going to be focused on just the legal entity incorporation, which is a bit of a smaller piece of what it means to be operational in a country. So yes, you can have a legal entity on paper, but the question is, are you registered for VAT, corporate income tax? Do you have a bank account? Can you make statutory payments? Can you make payments and collect payments with your vendors locally? So all of these things in terms of how to be actually operationally ready in a country are going to be really mixed up with this entity setup. So we find a lot of situations where clients are working with their attorney, but the attorney isn't looking at the client's full need, which is to be operationally ready. We had a funny situation, funny for me, not funny for the client, funny situation where the client had an attorney who was setting up entities for them in 20-something countries. And what I guess the lawyer didn't proactively share with the client was that they weren't going to be doing any of the tax registrations, and they weren't going to be doing anything after that. They were just studying the legal entities on paper, and that was that. And so what happened, the client was trying to get ready for payroll, and suddenly the payroll company is telling them, here's all the things that we need from you in order to be ready to actually finish getting the entity set up. So the client didn't have any of this ready, but what was worse is that what the payroll company was able to show them is say, well, we have employees in 4 different provinces in China. And the results of that means that you actually have to incorporate a branch in each of the additional provinces, because you can't just have one entity in China have employees living wherever they want. But the attorney, that was really, from their perspective, outside of what their requirements were in getting an entity set up. So the more questions you ask, the more questions come back. And so the amount of pre-work and preparations involved is really what's going to make it successful or delayed. And then, of course, setting up the employees. So you have to make sure all the payroll registrations are completed and all the HR registrations. Do you need pension in the country? What are the different medical checks that may be required? And how do you ensure that all of that is going to be done in time? And how long does each of that take? The employment contracts, of course, could be a very long matter. How do we figure out when it's included in the locally compliant employment contract? What is the employee expecting? And from a retention perspective, what are all of the aspects of their employment contract that are not locally compliant but are considered standard in order for the employees to actually say yes and then stay on board? And of course, throughout many countries in the world, we have works councils, collective bargaining agreements, unions. So there's a lot to consider in terms of what thresholds or what industries or what types of employees are you hiring, and what are the implications of all of that. And then, of course, the ongoing compliance, accounting, taxes, legal filings, payroll, making payments, HR admin, benefits administration, and data privacy and protection. So on the employer record side, we really cut down those requirements significantly. Because when we're looking at employer of record, again, we're just having somebody else hire those employees for us, and they take over everything that's required. But sometimes we have challenges because we say, well, if I want an NDA included, or I want to make sure I have an ironclad NDA included by my engineers who are working on really important technology that my competitors could copy, it's very hard to get approved in an employer of record. So you may have a little bit less flexibility when it comes to what you can put into an employment contract when someone else is the employer. You're there from a managerial, operational perspective, but legally on paper, you're leaving all of the admin to somebody else. And what's very common is actually having a mixed model. And so it could be short-term, you have an employee record that's short-term, or you have an employee record that's long-term. And you have entities overseas, and you have entities, then you have employee record overseas. So it's very common to say, let's say we have employer record, we have 3 individuals in a particular country. Now we're ready, we're going to grow a sales team. We decided this is a great idea for us, and we're going to actually grow our presence. And then you can make that transition, and there are ways to try to save yourself from some of the negotiations with the severance by creating tripartite agreements and other legal documentation to try and see what are the best ways that we have to transfer these employees from one employment to another. Now, M&A is something that I'm very passionate about. So M&A happens to take everything that we're talking about in terms of going overseas and really putting it on steroids. It makes everything more complicated. It makes everything more dramatic because the clock is ticking. And there's so many different nuances that come up at the last moment. So the question is, what does that mean in terms of going overseas, not organically, but through an acquisition? So you have, first you say, okay, well now I'm not hiring employees technically, I'm acquiring them, and they're being transferred over from the seller to the buyer. And so what are the implications of that? Well, a massive one has to do with the benefits, because what you need to do is take employees who could have been part of, let's say, a 500-person team in France, and you may, if you're doing a particular type of transaction, you may be only acquiring 5 of them. And so if you have employees who used to have this very rich list of benefits because they were part of a massive team, now there's only 5 of them, how do you legally replicate all the benefits if they are legally required to have replicated when you don't have access to those benefits because now there's only 5 people? And so there's a lot of work that goes into figuring out, how do we move these employees over? How do we give them an employment contract that's going to include the benefits if they are required to have when they're not available? And what can we offer them instead? And is it money or is it something else? And how do we get them to approve it? And is there a European council that's going to have to approve all of this? There are some countries that are going to have, that could have European works councils that have so much power that they may have the ability to say, you know what, thanks but no thanks. And Germany, for example, and move themselves out of this particular transaction. So there's a lot that goes into moving the employees over, and this requires significantly more time than many people would expect.